Hello, dear students, to our first class this semester. This subject, as you know, is called Science of Translation, and in Arabic it says الترجمة. And what you can see in front of you is the code of the course, and my name is Shireen Abu Naga. Now, before starting our first lesson in Unit 1, I need to explain a few things about the objectives and aims of this course. Now, this course is not going to teach you how to translate. So I'm not going to give you like a paragraph and ask you to turn this paragraph from English into Arabic or vice versa. This course does something else, something we all need. This course solves problems because as translators, you are bound to encounter problems while translating. So we need to know how to solve these problems. Translation is not just turning a text from one language into another. We encounter several problems. These problems could be linguistic, could be cultural, could be political. So one needs to understand if there are any rules to solve such problems. So this is the objective of this course is, let's say that the course introduces you to some of the problems and how to solve these problems. And of course, whether they are problems or solutions, these have names. These are concepts with names. So this is what we're going to do throughout 6 classes, and each class we will have something different. But of course, as always, the first class should always be a sort of introduction. At least we need to understand the meaning of science of translation. So this is lesson 1 from unit 1. And you can see the title. This is very direct. What is science of translation? What do we mean by this? Let's define together. We need some definitions. Definitions help. Let's begin with translation. Translation itself is an intuitive and cognitive process. That is, we do it by intuition. And cognitive means learning. So the process of translating entails 2 things. Intuition, that is spontaneity, very natural, and there is something that has to do with learning as well. When we translate, actually, we are doing a certain job. We are transporting and producing genre and texts cross-culturally. When I translate a text, I'm transporting it from one language to another, from one place to another. And also, I am translating, I'm transporting, I'm producing a certain genre. I might be translating a novel or a statement or a poem. And this text is being transported from one culture to the others. All in all, throughout the process of translation, whatever you are translating, the process remains mainly and intentionally political. Now, what do we mean by political here? I don't mean the politics of real life. Political here means there must be an aim. If you decide to translate this book, but not that book, then there must be an aim behind that. Maybe you want the readers of your culture to be introduced to a new field. Maybe you want them to read about a new theory. If you translate a certain statement, so maybe you want readers to know something about what happened as explained in the statement. So the fact that there is always an aim, this is what we mean by political. The very selection and choice of the text you want to translate is a political process in itself. What does this process entail? What does it generate? If I say I am going now to translate, what does that mean? What is the job description? Now, the discipline of translation entails three things. This is what we mean by threefold. It includes three things. The first thing is that translation in itself is a product. This is a product. When you translate something, you are producing a text. Yes, there is an original writer for this text, and yes, somebody wrote it, but when you transport this text from one language to another, you are producing something. This is number one. Two, when you start translating from beginning to end, this is a process. This is time. This is effort. This is a lot of thinking. So first I have a product, and also there is a process of doing the job itself. And the third side is the function of translation as a science. Translation in the past was merely regarded as an art, a talent. You have the talent for translation. But nowadays, in modern times, translators understand very well that translation is recognized as an academic discipline. It's not an art. Of course, you must have the talent and the desire to do that, but it is an academic discipline. It is a scientific operation. So when we say translation, you must think of three things: product, process, and the function of translation as a science. Today, there is what we call science of translation. That's why the course is called Science of Translation. Now, science of translation has been transformed into what we call translation studies. Translation studies. At present, translation studies which is just another name, another modern name for science of translation. That's why I told you it has become an academic field. Nowadays, translation studies is considered to be a discipline, an academic discipline. What do people do in this discipline? They study translation in general. I'm not saying they translate, no, they study translation. And this includes many things. For example, literary translation and other types of translation like scientific translation, medical translation, and interpretation. You see, when you see two presidents speaking together, there is always an interpreter for each one. So it studies all types of translation, interpretation, dubbing. Dubbing, this is when, for example, you have a film that is in Chinese, but then you find the actors and actresses speaking in English. This is what we call dubbing. And even subtitling, the subtitles on the film. All these go under translation studies. At the same time, in the field of translation studies, there is a wide range of research and teaching. This could be related to theory or specific research. It also includes translator training and assessment criteria, how to evaluate the product of translation. So you see, translation studies includes many things, types of translation, interpretation, subtitling, research, training, and even evaluation. That's why it has become an academic field. Now, one of the most famous theorists in the field of translation studies is called George Steiner. George Steiner. Yes, the S here is pronounced as sh because Steiner is a German name. What did he say? Now, Steiner has argued that translation theory presumes a systematic theory of language. So translation apparently is not an art anymore. It is a science. It is a science that assumes there is a systematic theory of language. There is a system. And this system is not left up to whoever is translating. No. This system follows certain rules. He also explained that communication is based on understanding, of course. If I communicate with you, even in the same language, and you do not understand what I'm saying, then there is no communication between us. So communication requires understanding, and understanding is only possible through translation processes across times, spaces, and different borders. This is what we mean by transporting the text cross-culturally. So if the peoples of the world want to establish a successful communication, then they have to understand each other. And understanding is only possible through translation. This translation, or rather transformation, since the translator transforms the text from one language to another, from one culture into another, this transformation, this transportation, this translation is always interpretive. That is, it explains to the reader what he or she does not understand. And at the same time, this is a creative process. So translation is not just copying the text from this language to another. No, there is something creative here, and it has certain aims. One of these aims is establishing successful communication. So as you can see, these are very general points that you need to remember about translation studies as an academic field. And there are certain words that you need to remember, like transportation, communication, cross-cultural, across time, spaces. Okay. And there is something creative all the time in this process of translation. So this was a very general introduction of science of translation. And the next lesson, we need to go into more details. Okay. Welcome again, students. Now, this is lesson 2 in unit 1. In lesson 1, we have looked at the meaning, the modern meaning of science of translation, or what we have come to call now translation studies. Now, in this lesson, we are doing something different. We are talking about the ethics and objectives of translation. And of course, you know, ethics means أخلاقيات. أخلاقيات. When you say ethical code, it means ميثاق شرف. So we need to talk about the ethics of translation and objectives. Again, our objectives in this course in more detail. So what do we mean by ethics of translation? One might wonder, what do you mean by that? You give me a text and I just translate it. So what do you mean by this? What's wrong with that? Let's try to understand. Ethics of translation. Now, the science of translation is built on ethical standards that relate to its cross-cultural and mediating operation between a source text, ST, and the target text, TT. What does that mean? It means that this science, this translation in general, the process of translation, the product of translation is always based on certain ethical codes, ethical standards. معايير أخلاقية. Ethical standards of what? What are they about? They relate to its cross-cultural and mediating operation. They relate to transporting the culture of the text from its original place to another place. You cannot, you should not, you are not allowed to lie, for example, about the culture you are translating. Should be very honest. You are transporting the culture itself. So you should be very accurate. And of course, you cannot change the words in any text, the mediating operation. This is what we mean by mediating operation. So you cannot mess up with either the culture or the medium itself. Because you want to transform the source text, this is the original text you are translating, into the target text. For example, from English, that would be the source text, and abbreviation of this is ST. You're moving that into Arabic, and this is what we call target text. You are targeting the Arabic. So you have to be very careful about the culture and the mediating operation. Of course, when we say mediating operation, you might be wondering, what do we mean? Of course, we are translating, yes, but this translation could be done in writing or in simultaneous interpretation or in subtitling. Okay, so this is what we mean by mediating operation. The general ethical prerequisites, the general ethical codes, conditions that we need to pay attention to are found in three things. The first thing is fidelity. This is what we mean by when I said honesty. Honesty. You have to move the meaning, the same meaning, from one text to another, from the ST to the TT. You cannot change the meaning. Because if you change the meaning, then you are changing everything. So we're speaking here about number one, fidelity, honesty. Two, adaptiveness. Do not give me words in the translation that I do not understand. That you cannot do that, because part of the process of translation is to make me understand so that I could establish a successful communication. So you have to adapt this, the ST into a clear TT. And intelligibility. I want to read clear sentences. I want to read something that I understand. Don't give me a sentence that goes on for 2 pages. I want to understand. Otherwise, I'm not going to read that translated book. So fidelity, adaptiveness, and intelligibility. And of course, these three concepts, fidelity, adaptiveness, and intelligibility, we are going to look more at them in detail, not as part of the ethics, but as some of the problems we might encounter. So in order to understand these concepts, fidelity, adaptiveness, and intelligibility, we are going to do a lot of things in the course. But let me tell you about what we are not doing in this course. In this course, we are not translating articles or paragraphs or expressions. We are not going to learn and memorize idioms and new vocabulary. And definitely, we are not going to learn grammar, because I assume you know that. And there is another course that does the first two things, translating and expressions and learning idioms and new vocabulary. So we are not doing that. What are we doing then? We're going to learn the different approaches to translation. Oh, wow, what does that mean? Approach to translation? Are there different approaches to translation? What do you mean by this? I just put the article in front of me and I turn that into Arabic. No, no. There are different approaches. They are all correct. It depends which one to use. We are going to solve problems of translation. When I come across a word in English and I don't know how to do that in Arabic. And we need also to understand what we should do before translation. Before translation. PT, prior to translation. So apparently there is a sort of preparation for translating. You cannot just take the book and immediately sit and start translating. You need to prepare before translating. So this is what we are going to do in this course. We'll learn different approaches to translation, we'll solve problems of translation, and we will learn what we should be doing before translation, before embarking on the process itself. And then in the next lesson, we will be talking about the history of the science of translation and the main concepts. We are still working on Unit 1. So far, we have done ethics code in translation, and we have learned what we are going to do and what we are not going to do in this course. Now, let's go to deeper into some concepts. Question is there any history for translation studies, for the science of translation? Everything in the world should have a history, how it started, how it developed, how it has been formed as we see it today. So what is the history of translation studies? This is one thing. And the other thing we're going to do now is the main concepts we are going to work with. Two main important concepts, مفاهيم, that we need to pay attention to. Okay, now the history of translation studies, we're not going to take a history lesson, don't worry. No, we just want to understand around what this history has been built. So the history of translation theory, translation studies, science of translation can be imagined as two things. The first thing is the changing relationships between the autonomy of the translated texts or the translator's action. Now, this is the first point around which the history of translation studies has been built. Yani the whole history revolves around this point. What is this point? The relative autonomy, which means independence of the translated text. On the other side, the translator's action. Now, if the translated text is so autonomous, is completely independent, then what is the job of the translator? If the translator has the utter freedom to do whatever he or she wants with the text, then the text is not autonomous. So it's this relationship between the text and the translator. And this is something that has been debated and negotiated throughout history, and this is what forms the history of translation studies. The second point around which this history revolves is two important concepts: the concept of equivalence and the concept of function. So let me put it again for you in another way. The title of the lesson is History and Main Concepts. Okay, so we started with the history of translation studies, how it was formed. All the time it has been revolving around certain things، بيدور حول إشكاليات معينة. Now, these problematics are the points that has formed the history of translation studies. وطبعا they are changing all the time, they are changing, okay? So the first thing is the relationship between the text and the translator. The second thing is certain main concepts that we need to understand: equivalence and function. That's why in the title you have history and main concepts. Equivalence and function, and of course the role of the translator and how far I should keep the text autonomous are the main points that we are going to talk about in this course. With every lesson, we are going to add more to our knowledge about these points. What's the meaning of equivalence? Equivalence simply means accuracy, adequacy, correctness, correspondence, fidelity. You remember fidelity when we did it in the ethical code, or identity. So when I translate a text, the translation should be equivalent, accurate, دقيقة, adequate, which means enough, adequate, كافية من ناحية نقل المعنى, correct. The translation should correspond to the source text. Fidelity, there should be honesty in order to keep the identity of the text. Because sometimes we read a translation that comes out very different from the original text the source text. So equivalence is one of the most important concepts. It is a variable notion of how the translation, the TT, target text, is connected to the foreign text or source text, the ST. Equivalence, in order to render an equivalent, correct, accurate, honest translation, requires a deep understanding of both cultures, the source culture and the target culture. So actually, it's not enough to be an expert in the language. It's not only about the language, because you can simply speak both languages, Arabic and English, for example, fluently. But if you do not understand the idiom and culture behind those languages, then the translation would be just funny and not accurate. So it's not just about turning a word from English into Arabic. Otherwise, everybody could have been a translator. Just check the dictionary and put the translation. Every language has its own culture. Arabic has its own culture. English has its own culture. Any language is founded on a culture. So I need to understand the culture. It's the understanding the language is not enough. Understanding the culture behind the language helps the translator to render an equivalent translation. Therefore, a literal translation is a useless translation. It doesn't mean anything at all. Sometimes, and you can try that, just put any sentence on Google, Google Translate, and you will have a funny translation because this is a literal translation. So equivalence is a powerful tool that serves the goal of rendering an equivalent, accurate, adequate text. But it can only be successful when you have a deep understanding of the culture from which you are translating. Okay. So equivalence is a main concept. It's the most important concept in translation. But actually, you cannot have this equivalence by understanding the language only. No. You also need to understand the culture behind the language. Once you do this, you render an equivalent, accurate text. What about the concept of function? That was about equivalence. What about function? Function of what? Now, every text in the world is meant to convey certain feelings. It's meant to give certain effects. Any text has, this. Whether it's a statement, an official statement, or a love poem. So once I start translating, I have to keep in mind the function of this text. So I cannot, for example, translate a tragedy into Arabic, and then people read this play, this tragic play, and they start laughing. This means there is something wrong, because people should laugh when they read a comedy, not a tragedy. So the function of the text is very important. When I translate, I have to keep the function of the source text in mind. I have to understand why I am translating this text, which feeling I want to convey to the reader in the target language. I have to keep it. I have to produce a response comparable to the response produced by the source text. The response of the reader should be the same. If it is not the same, then there is something wrong. So equivalence and function. Okay? Function relates to the feelings of the text, the source text. While translating, I have to produce, again, these feelings, these effects. Let's have an example of understanding the culture, the importance of understanding the culture, the idioms, the function. Let's look at this. I accept the job. It's a piece of cake. أقبل العمل. إنه قطعة من الكعك. Well, that's a correct translation, right? It's a piece of cake. قطعة من الكعك. But what does this mean? If you read it in Arabic, well, you understand the first half of the sentence. أقبل العمل, I accept the job. What about this second part? قطعة من الكعك. This is funny. So we have to understand while translating that in English culture, when they say it's a piece of cake, it means سهل أمر بسيط للغاية. إذن سأقبل العمل لأنه بسيط للغاية أو سهل للغاية. This is an idiom. But you need to understand the culture behind this language to render an equivalent translation, because this is a funny one. قطعة من الكعك. Let's look at another example. I am so sad. The old man down the street kicked the bucket. أنا حزينة للغاية. Okay, I'm so sad. We understand this. الرجل الكبير, the old man, down the street, تحت الشارع, kicked the bucket. اصطدم بالدلو. What's the meaning of تحت الشارع? And also, هل إن شخص يصطدم بالدلو should make me حزينة للغاية? That's not comprehensible. There's something wrong here in this sentence. I'm so sad لأن الرجل المسن down the street is always translated as في نهاية الشارع. الرجل الكبير أو المسن الذي يسكن في نهاية الشارع, down the street. خدوا بالكم, prepositions are used differently in English and Arabic. So down the street, down here does not mean تحت أو أسفل. It means في نهاية الشارع. Kicked the bucket is another idiom, like a piece of cake. Kicked the bucket is an idiom that means died, passed away. So أنا حزينة للغاية لأن الرجل المسن الذي يقطن في نهاية الشارع توفي أو simply met. So kick the bucket here is again an idiom that relates to the culture. So these were two examples that show you And understanding the language only is not enough. That's not enough at all. And that does not help the translator to render an equivalent product. Equivalence requires understanding the culture and the idioms. Okay? And we need to keep the function of the source text, the effects, the feelings. We need to produce the same response of the source text. So these are the things that we need to keep in mind whenever we are starting a process of translation. Equivalence, function, culture, and we have learned the abbreviations ST, source text, TT, target text. This is so far the field of translation studies, or the meaning of science of translation, that we need to go more into its layers and to understand more concepts about it. And this is what we are going to do starting from the next unit.